Hello, everyone.
Oh my goodness.
So it's special for that
Yeah,
reason.
yeah.
That was the cat's
Welcome back to the room. Thank you all for your good cheer. I'm going to do the really quick intro so that we can maximize the amount of time that we have with our panel today. I'm Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the library. Welcome to the Library Book Talk. We're super excited to have you all here. There are copies of today's book for sale right outside the room if you want to grab a copy after the talk. I want to let you know that the talk today is being recorded. It will appear on our YouTube channel in a couple of days to next week. Part of the reason why I tell you that is that your questions will also be on our YouTube channel, so if that's a concern for you, I would not ask a question. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our panel to discuss Stand Your Ground, A History of America's Love Affair with Lethal Self-Defense. I'm going to start with our author, Caroline Light. Professor Light is a lecturer and the director of undergraduate studies on women, gender, and sexuality here at Harvard. Next to her is Professor Patricia Williams, a Radcliffe Institute Carl and Lily Pforzheimer Foundation Fellow, and the James L. Dohr Professor of Law at Columbia, where she teaches and writes in the area of race, gender, and law. Next to her is Professor Ronald S. Sullivan, Jr., a clinical professor of law and director of the Criminal Justice Institute here at HLS. Professor Sullivan blends theory and practice in the areas of criminal law and procedure, legal ethics, and race theory, among others. And next to him is Professor Jeannie Gersen, the John H. Watson Jr. Professor of Law, also here at HLS. She teaches and writes in a wide variety of areas, particularly relevant to today's talk, are in the areas of gender, sexuality in the law, criminal law and procedure, and constitutional law. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Light to introduce her book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. I want to apologize. I'm losing my voice. I feel fine, but it's been an ongoing struggle. Can you hear me? I also want to thank June Casey and Jane Bester for making this event possible, and to everybody who came out and returned after our fire alarm. I'm incredibly honored to be here at the law school, and especially to be sharing this space and this conversation with three scholars whose work I've long admired. I want to say a couple of comments about how my book originated and also where things stand today with not just Stand Your Ground, but the larger constellation of violent practices and epistemologies in which it's rooted. When I started writing the book back in 2012, it was shortly after Trayvon Martin, who was unarmed, 17 years old, in a Florida suburb, was gunned down and killed. His killer walked free, was exonerated in a court of law. And after that, I noticed another 17-year-old teenage young man, also in Florida, Jordan Davis, was also gunned down, was killed. And I saw it happen again and again. Renisha McBride in Detroit, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Michael Brown in Ferguson, and the names go on and on and on. And there's this formulaic narrative, one that's historically rooted. It's this endless formulaic narrative of blackness being itself perceived as a threat, and perhaps most importantly, a pattern of white masculinity that gets exonerated based on claims of having been in fear for their lives. In other words, they escape criminal prosecution by insisting that they had acted in self-defense. So I was interested, since I'm a historian, and I recognize this as part of a long-standing narrative in history in the United States where blackness itself has been seen as a threat to white safety and to white property over and over again, and how our courts continue to allow deadly white masculinity to walk free. And so just to quickly recap, the Stand Your Ground laws from which I took my title are just a part of the book, but basically they were first passed in Florida in 2005. Since then, they've passed in roughly 33 states, have different kinds of incarnations of Stand Your Ground laws, and essentially They provide for the expansion of the Castle Doctrine into public space, which essentially means that the Castle Doctrine's exception to the duty to retreat means that you can fight back with lethal violence if you reasonably perceive yourself to be in threat of bodily harm or death. And what has happened in the wake of the passage of these laws is that they provide it's an additional legal innovation to allow white claims of self-defense to justify the murder and maiming of non-white and impoverished communities. So I wanted to look back in time to see how the Castle Doctrine itself has always been selectively applied in the United States. And so part of my book is a genealogy of what that castle actually means. And to look at how the dependency on tropes of self-defense and self-defensive violence have been a recurring theme in United States history, that none of this is really that new. In other words, stand your ground laws are a new legal innovation, but they're part of a very long tradition, part of a broad constellation of interlocking and, I would say, mutually implicating power structures. Based also on epistemologies of stranger danger, wherein particular kinds of people are seen as a reasonable threat, specifically to whiteness. And then the concentration of legal lethal violence into the hands of the few to the increased precarity of the multitudes. And then as we sit here today after what happened on Sunday, I want to think about the larger context, too, of lethal violence and the proliferation of armed citizenship. We see yet another rampage in which an armed, angry white man with his own personal arsenal of weapons that are actually legal in the United States shot and killed, believe the count is now 58 people, and he wounded hundreds of people in Las Vegas. And then following this tragedy, gun stores are selling out of their stock. The gun manufacturer stock prices have been going up in the past couple of days. And as we ask why, I want to think about not just the widespread belief that in the Second Amendment, we can talk about that if the panelists would like to. I would love to talk about the selective application of the Second Amendment. But they also believe that the only thing that will keep them and their families safe is being continually armed and ready to shoot to kill, that there's a certain kind of bodily practice tethered to this notion about lethal self-defense and who has a right to engage in it. So even though it's been scientifically proven again and again that more guns equal more gun deaths, there's this urgently seductive promise that lethal self-defense is the only thing that will keep us safe. On top of everything, this wider pattern of this particular mass shooting represents a pattern that often gets downplayed or obfuscated in our larger narratives about so-called lone wolves and isolated incidents. We're a nation with the highest incidence of mass shootings in the world. We also have the most firearms in the world. We have a firearm for every person, including babies in the United States, because we need our babies to be armed. And this formulaic pattern of white masculine violence again and again gets dismissed as an outlier, as another evil lone wolf kind of unanchored from this repeating pattern of historicized, racialized, gendered violence. It's dehistoricized and it's dismissed. So I want to frame all of this beyond just blaming the NRA, because it is convenient to point to the NRA with all of their power and their influence and their money and other corporatized powers that support absolutist notions of gun rights. But I don't think that the NRA and allies could succeed in naturalizing self-defensive violence without our wider cultures and states' complicity in promoting widespread security panic, fueled by anxiety over racialized notions of stranger danger, and the system of white supremacist criminalization that's also rooted in our settler colonialist and racial capitalist national origins. So we are a nation that's well primed for the NRA's special brand of panic-based propaganda.
So ultimately, what I tried to do in my book was to use theories of intersectionality that I learned from reading the work of Black feminist theorists to call out and to render transparent the historically rooted recurring trope of white masculine aggression performed in the service of self-defense, violence that's exonerated through appeals to white masculine, and occasionally, when it's expedient, white feminine vulnerability. So with that, I just want to thank you all again for coming out. I want to thank the panelists, not just for being here and sharing your time and your insights today, but also for the work that you've done to make the theory hit the road, to make the practice and theory come together.
I also want to apologize because I also have trouble speaking, and I have some sort of allergy that is making me feel dreadful. I am hopped up on Benadryl, so if I somehow skip the verb in any particular sentence, fill it in for me, please. Sorry. But I loved Caroline's book because it really did help me think about the concept of the Castle Doctrine as a kind of imaginary geography, and therefore tie it together with some of the theories in very helpful ways. For example, like Judith Butler, when she talks about sovereignty, because the Castle Doctrine as an imaginary floating sense of mastery over everything around you and taken out of the property ownership sphere of one's home and then into public streets really is about sovereignty disconnected from governmentality. She speaks of this, Judith Butler speaks of it in the context of Guantanamo Bay, for example. But it is, it made me think when I was thinking of Stephen Paddock. In Australia, there is this man who protested the wheat tariffs to which he was subject, and he set himself up in something called the Principality of Hutt. And he has about 8,000 acres that he calls his own principality. And it's literally his own sovereign state with its own coinage and its own realm, and it's funny, and it's become a tourist attraction. And the Australian government sort of lets him get away with it to greater or lesser degree. And there's something comic about it, but when I began to think about it, there's almost something structurally similar to what we have done with stand your ground laws, that we have created a kind of principality of Hutt around those who are in the position of asserting, of claiming their individual sovereignty. And like Stephen Paddock, you can have a standing army, not just stand your ground, but you can have a standing army. And that made me think also, when you were talking about a kind of bodily practice, of the relationship between persons and things, because a lot of that willingness to see people walk around, whether police officers, whether George Zimmerman, whether individuals like Stephen Paddock, to give them that much power, suspended from due process, or due process only subject to the subjectivity of what they deem reasonable. And we give great deference by this standard to what is internally reasonable rather than collectively governed. Again, that's what I mean by the disconnect between sovereignty and governmentalism. But that kind of bodily practice, as you say, also reminds me of what Robert Esposito talks about in his book Persons and Things, that there is an affective relation in some cultures that is recognized more readily than in ours. And so when we say guns don't kill people, people kill people, it is as though we can handily say that guns have no affective power, that they're not part of our imagination. They're not an extension of ourselves. And again, that's what I thought was so lovely in Caroline's book, is this sense in which the geography of power includes those prosthetics which seem to have no limit, even when it's 23 automatic weapons modified to be the equivalent of a war zone.
So I, too, will begin with apologizing that my voice is often too loud. So we'll just go from there. So Caroline Light's, it's abundantly clear that this is an important book. It's a terrific history. It well tracks the English law of self-defense, the early Anglo-American version of this legal justification for citizens' uses of deadly force. It tracks the rise of the Castle Doctrine and the formation of a species of that doctrine that brings us here today called Stand Your Ground. In other words, she gives, as she put it, a thoroughgoing genealogy of how Stand Your Ground developed. But a good history does more, and Professor Light's book does so much more. It tells a compelling story not just of how the law developed in sterile terms, but why the law developed. At every turn, she reminds the reader that the law is not hermetically sealed, that the law is a function of people, of human beings, and they bring their biases and priors to the table when people sit down and actually physically write the law. It is not sealed from the normative universe. So in looking at the book, a few other things are importantly clear. It gives an account of the values, both seen and importantly unseen, that motivated the formation of the law. Stand Your Ground reminds us that the law quite visibly grew out of conceptions of honor and chivalry and the right to be free from attack, and that these things that were deeply entrenched in Southern culture. The law tangibly grew out of these norms. Professor Light reminds us that the formal law reflected the then existing societal norms that decided that the private right of law enforcement or private law enforcement was the way to resolve difficulties. Think old bar fights, right? Private law enforcement was an effective and accepted way to resolve difficulties. Hence, we see the phrases develop and creep into our law like a man's home is his castle, true man doctrine, and eventually Stand Your Ground. And with this vocabulary creep came the abdication of an important limiting principle in our law of self-defense, and that is a duty to retreat when it's reasonably safe to do so. But Professor Light's book does so much more. It explores the unseen values that are baked into the doctrine. In this sense, Professor Light offers a brilliant legal history of how putatively neutral categories like law-abiding citizen and ideal citizen was merely proxy for white proxied men. In other words, the right to use lethal force, the right to use lethal self-defense to stand your ground does not have, nor has it ever had, universal application. A fair read of Professor Light's work leads the reader to conclude that stand your ground laws affirmatively authorize white propertied males to murder others with the authorization of law. Equally insidious, when others attempt to benefit from these putatively equal laws, they are punished to the full extent and with the full force of the law. Data corroborates this claim. We know that the rate of conviction in the criminal justice system correlates with the race of the victim. Defendants of all races are more likely to be convicted if the victim is white. This disparity is even more profound when comparing disposition in stand your ground states versus non-stand your ground states. In non-stand your ground states, whites are 250% more likely to prevail on a theory of justified homicide of a black person as compared to a white victim. By contrast, in stand your ground states, whites are 354% more likely to prevail when a victim is black. I could go on with the data and show similar disparities with the law's application to women, to our trans community and other minority groups, but you all have not come to hear me talk. Suffice it to say, Professor Light paints a poignant word picture of the history and the impact of stand your ground laws in the United States and how this country, one based on laws and not individuals, has, to use her words, a selective right to kill baked into the positive law in a majority of U.S. states. Query, where is the outrage at this?
Thank you.
So I do want to compliment Professor Light on this book and also start with the usual preamble about my voice. I have been suffering from a cough for 4 weeks, as some of my students readily can acknowledge. So please excuse the occasional hesitations and interruptions. One thing to keep in mind, I love the idea that this book, Caroline's description of this book as a genealogy of what the castle means. Because the Castle Doctrine is, of course, a standard legal doctrine that all 1Ls in criminal law encounter in their study of self-defense. And it has a historical specificity that Professor Light really brings to life, and the particularly racialized aspect of the Castle Doctrine and the ideas coming out of it is, I think it's a groundbreaking work that she has accomplished, because we in the 20th century, in the 21st century, are aware of the ways in which cases like the Trayvon Martin case really brought this to our attention, but tracing it back to the beginning of the doctrine, the beginning of the English common law, and then up here in the United States, and how that transformed, it really adds great depth to our understanding of the Castle Doctrine's racialized roots from the beginning, and also the part that I'm going to focus on, the gendered aspects of the Castle Doctrine. As you may gather, the castle itself, if you think about what it was in England, where people had castles, it was a technology of military defense against invaders into the territory, into the realm. And so from the beginning, the idea of the castle had this idea of protecting the country, the realm, the territory that you are supposed to be in charge of. And it is, in my view, not a total accident or coincidence that our laws, the Castle Doctrine laws, the stand your ground laws that we've been talking about, that proliferated from 2005 to the present, happened only a few years after September 11, 2001, when we, as a country, people felt suddenly much more insecure than they ever had. I know a lot of the people in the room are young folks who may not have lived adult lives prior to September 11, 2001. But this was a huge moment in terms of the nation's idea of, are we safe here, and are we safe from foreign intruders who are out to kill innocent people. And I think that idea was actually really, really important, because we saw that rhetoric come into the promotion and the advocacy in favor of the stand your ground laws that proliferated from 2005 until now, in that the idea was the homeland had been breached so violently, terrifyingly, and devastatingly. And then there was a preoccupation very soon after that with protecting the home, the castle. And then an extension of the idea of the home as the protected space where you can kill an intruder who comes in into public space. Anywhere where you have a right to be is kind of like your mini home. And so if people are threatening you, then you have the right to stand your ground and not retreat. So I want to focus on the gendered piece of this a bit. In the sort of late 19th and early 20th century, the courts encountered the situation of what happens if two male roommates live in the same house and one of them attacks the other one. Do you have a duty to retreat if both of them live there? If the person who's attacked, home is a man's castle, right? So if it's the castle, you're not supposed to have an obligation to retreat from an attack. But then what if it's a roommate who attacks you? And courts did rely on the idea of the castle to say, you don't have to retreat from an attacker who lives with you in the home. Okay, now fast forward about 100 years, and we get to the late 1990s when we've had, maybe a couple decades of feminist advocacy, especially focused on the home, violence against women, domestic violence. And we've got women now coming into the courts and saying, I killed my husband in self-defense. It was self-defense. And again, the question is, did the person who was accused have a duty to retreat from the attacker? Do the courts say the home is your castle and therefore no duty to retreat before killing the attacker? No, they do not. In theory, the woman who is battered could be a true man, just like the true man of the classic Castle Doctrine. But the courts don't say that. What they do say is that a battered woman is so helpless and is so incapable of engaging in retreat. And so her incapacity to retreat, as opposed to the ideal of autonomy that we see in the true man doctrine, that is what excuses her lack of retreat. So in effect, the courts did achieve the same result in saying there are situations in which women are battered and they didn't have to retreat, but they don't rely on this extremely gendered and racialized idea of the castle, in part proving what Professor Light's thesis is, which is to show the historical specificity, the racialized, the gender-specific idea that lies behind the standard ground and the duty to retreat. So advocates of the new laws since 2005 have leveraged the idea of the home, the classic idea that in your home you don't have to retreat from anyone. If they intrude, you can shoot and kill them. They have leveraged that idea. They have expanded that into public spaces where a person has a right to be there. He's not there illegally, so therefore he can shoot if he's attacked. And the significant part of the marketing around the laws as they were being promoted by the NRA was also expressly gendered and expressly focused on women and the image of women having to protect themselves against male violence. So explicitly drawing on the feminist narrative of women essentially being attacked by rapists, right, in a car or in their home. The focus on male violence against women, whether it was a strange man or a husband. Both of those ideas came into very prominently into play in these very laws that we have seen tragically result in the deaths of unarmed people. And so I think that it is the combination, it's a very potent combination, the classic idea of the home, the idea of who's a victim, and the way that the victimhood of women became conscripted in the promotion of the law to promote these laws and also to then map on the victim-perpetrator model onto people like Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, so that it's really about protecting lawful victims who are not doing anything wrong and that they do not have to retreat in self-defense. That became very powerful rhetorically, and my point really is to point out the way that it's about race, of course, but the gendered piece of it and the victimization language associated with women that courts readily adopted in the late 1990s really had an important part to play here as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So should I spend a little time responding or open to questions, or do we have enough time? That'd be great. Okay, this is all so helpful. Thank you so much. I was crazily taking notes because everything you all said I think is so powerful and important. And I want to start, I guess, with Professor Sullivan's inquiry. Where's the outrage? What we have are troves and troves of data showing the extent to which the current laws exacerbate. They don't start, they exacerbate already existing injustices, violent racial injustices. And yet, actually what's happening is, I think, if anything, these laws are becoming more widespread, and they're becoming they're becoming intensified, actually. I know in Florida, the burden of proof has switched now to make it more difficult for the prosecution to prove that somebody is responsible in a case of lethal self-defense.
So if anything, I think they're becoming amplified. I didn't mention it before, but every state in the nation now, as of 2014, allows civilians to carry concealed weapons. So that's every state in the nation. Now, they vary from state to state. There are more states adopting something called constitutional carry, which is essentially, if you're a, quote, law-abiding citizen, again, it's that sort of free-floating, appearingly neutral terminology about law-abiding citizenship. If you're a law-abiding citizen who has legally obtained a firearm, that you are allowed to carry that outside of your home, and the justification continually is self-defense. I want to speak to the gender piece, too, because I actually think that Professor Gersen brought up is incredibly important right now as we look at the strategic way in which the corporatized universe is trying to market this idea of violent self-defense, specifically to women. I'm thinking of campus carry as one of those innovations, and the way that campus carry is, essentially it means campuses are adopting the terms by which students who are of age, who are law-abiding citizens, again, to carry their weapons around campus. So this is passed in several places. I believe Georgia is most recent to pass campus concealed carry, is being marketed as the solution to sexual assault. And so at the center of this narrative is the vulnerable woman, the vulnerable young college woman who, if only she had her weapon, she would not have been subject to sexual violence. I don't even know where to go with that, except to say that it's incredibly absurd when you look at all the research that has been done, some of it right here at the School of Public Health, on the way in which the existence of a gun actually makes it more likely that a woman will be killed, especially in situations of gender and sexual violence. But I also want to say that what I try to do in the book was not to look through one lens or the other when it comes to race and gender, but to look simultaneously. So I think, for instance, of the passage or the time leading up to the passage of our nation's first Stand Your Ground law, 2004, 2005, that the narratives that were trotted out in front of the legislators of Florida had to do with, for instance, you might have been mentioning Marion Hammer, who was former president of the NRA and a very effective lobbyist, a powerful lobbyist, a white woman, repeatedly told a story, a very powerful story, about how she found herself in a dark parking garage where she was pursued by a carload of young thugs, and how instead of, realizing that she would suffer a, quote, fate worse than death, she pulled her pistol out of her purse and stood in front of the car, and they backed off. So she stood her ground, and it's this recurrent, again, formulaic narrative, but it's white femininity in danger, and it's this, even though it's not explicit on the surface of what she's saying, it's coded language about thugs and criminality that in our nation's history is racialized and gendered to imply non-white men. And so the power of that narrative, I believe, is what helped convince the legislators in Florida that they could not politically vote against this law without committing political suicide. So I guess what I would argue is that I think that we need to attend simultaneously to these interlocking structures of power, the gender, the race, also class implications of widespread armed citizenship in the United States. So I guess in the time, should we take some questions, or do you all have anything? Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and open it up for questions. Hi.
Thank you so much, everybody, for the talks. I've learned a ton from Caroline Light's book, and I was just wondering if any of you wanted to comment on what you think self-defense law ought to look like. So at one extreme, it seems pretty clear that many of the open carry and campus carry adjustments to the self-defense law are a poor idea, and as is dropping the duty to retreat, perhaps. But then at the other extreme, it seems a little bit difficult to picture what any sort of law would look like if there wasn't self-defense law. So I'm just wondering on your thoughts of, what should it look like? And is the problem, if we can say what it looks like, are the residual difficulties just difficulties with applying the idea of, who is a threat and where is the castle? Or is there some problem at the level of the formulation of the law itself, at the level of abstraction that laws have to operate at?
Thank you, Susanna. That's a hard question. I'm gonna try. I'm gonna take a crack, and then I'm going to defer to my friends who are legal scholars also for their feedback on this. But I think it's a both and to this. What my deep dive into the archive of legal language has shown me that a lot of the laws, including the recent Stand Your Ground laws, are on the surface gender neutral, race neutral, class neutral, everything. They appear to be neutral, and they're deliberately structured that way. A lot of the problems have to do with procedure. How are they implemented? And there are multiple levels at which certain kinds of assumptions, for instance, about what it is reasonable to fear and who is allowed to fear whom. So there's multiple levels in terms of, as you've written about, perception. Whose perception of threat will our legal system honor? And I would say that actually the problem is a massive structural problem, not just with the legal system. It's what it's embedded in. It's steeped in a historically toxic, white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist society where certain kinds of privileges are always already going to be honored. Certain ideas of sovereignty, as Professor Williams has put it, are going to be protected deliberately. So I don't really know how to answer that except to say that I think it is a both and problem.
Shall I try? Not only are these laws, if you actually go pull up these statutes, the Florida one included, if you look at them and read them, you might yourself, I think that I often have students do this exercise, they might come up with exactly what it says if they came up with an ideal self-defense law that didn't have a duty to retreat in public space. And I think it's important to remember the lack of duty to retreat in public space is not an invention of 2005 onward, but it also existed in the majority of states before 2005, just through the 19th century evolution of doctrine in America. So the duty to retreat itself had existed, and then the abrogation of that duty to retreat also had existed, and so the majority was not having that anyway. In 2005, what we saw was the passage of these laws that in some ways codified what already existed at common law, but then the rhetoric around it, the cultural assumptions, the cultural stories that fed into it, that is what more connects with the racialized applications that we have seen, rather than that the definitions themselves are somehow unfair. You might quibble with this thing or that, but those, in my view, are not what's causing the kinds of tragedies, the specifically racial injustice tragedies that we have seen. It's really about our culture and the assumption of what, as Caroline points out, what is considered reasonable to whom. The term reasonableness, are we going to get rid of reasonableness as a test for the legal system? Well, I tried to come up with a better one many times with my students. It's very hard. So if you're going to keep reasonableness, you're going to import some idea of what does that mean? And that may, in fact, have a tilt. It definitely will have a tilt. But it is hard to say that is the thing we need to get rid of in order to solve our problem of racialized violence.
So I agree that it wouldn't solve the problem, but I would tinker with the doctrine. I think stand your ground is an unnecessary expansion of common law right of self-defense. Very briefly, I think if we keep the three standard norms, proportionality, immediacy, and a duty to retreat when reasonable to do so, that would do the work that stand your ground purports to do. So I won't go into a bunch of legal mumbo jumbo, but stand your ground changes presumptions in weird ways that empowers people to behave in this frontiersman-like way and takes us back to the wild, wild west. So I think that the law encourages certain behavior that it ought not to. I do agree with both the previous speakers that the central problem, though, it's what's baked into the law, this history that animated the law. One very quick example. This is language very similar to what proponents of Stand Your Ground argued, and it sounds extraordinarily neutral. It's this. We exist to protect the weak, the innocent, and the defenseless from the indignities, wrongs, and outrages of the lawless, the violent, and the brutal. Right. On its face, right? That sounds fine, right? Agreed? I mean, nothing on its face wrong with that. You know, until you know this comes from the founding documents of the Ku Klux Klan. That is their founding animating principle. And when these sorts of notions are baked into the doctrine itself, you see these sorts of results.
Notion?
I think it's both.
Can I just say something, because we use the word narrative a lot and one of the things in reading Caroline's book that I thought was really apparent but subtle is the degree to which in criminal law and in the exercise of defenses we usually analyze in courts what has happened. We are looking in a past tense. And I think it's not just about rhetoric or narrative, it's also about tenses. And stand your ground is almost always described in a potentiality. So it creates a state of emergency, that is to say, emergencying. So it is what could happen. It's not what did happen. It actually grants legal protection to an imaginary space that exists in something like the subjunctive. And every time we really talk about a successful assertion of it, it meets that rhetorical standard. You see it over and over again, right down to the actual sovereign who says, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody. It's that potentiality that then becomes the actual standard rather than, you know, our traditional due process standard of what did happen by the three metrics that you mentioned.
Can I say one more thing about ground? As you were speaking, I was thinking about what ground are we talking about too? And if we're thinking about historical precedent, we need to be mindful of the fact that these original doctrines about, Second Amendment rights and for whom does the Bill of Rights apply? It was specifically exclusionary to those people who were Aboriginal to this territory. And it was also exclusionary to those people who were considered property at the time. So if we think about it in terms of precedent that's rooted in an explicitly settler colonialist slave-based society, somehow it makes more sense how stand your ground itself can't possibly be neutral.
Other questions?
You might be familiar with the story of Marissa Alexander, the woman in Florida who was abused by her husband, and he approached her, I think after they were estranged, and she fired a warning shot. She didn't fire at him. She fired a warning shot and got 20 years in prison after failing to successfully invoke the stand your ground defense. And I was wondering if your book explores the reasons. Oh, it is in the book.
But I'm glad you brought it up.
Do you examine the ways, or like if the successful application of stand your ground defense falls along gender lines, and if so, why is that the case?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think Marissa Alexander, also in Florida, right, and many others, I've found a lot of examples of women trying to defend themselves, often non-lethally, like Alexander. She didn't hurt anybody. She shot a warning shot. When women try to try to defend themselves from their violent spouses, statistically the most likely people to be attacking them, by the way. when they try to use stand your ground, they're ultimately criminalized. So as you mentioned, Marissa Alexander was sentenced and was, I think, spent 3 years in jail and then 2 years on house arrest. And then for me, after the book was out, she actually was one of the people supporting the shift of the burden of proof. And my analysis of that would be that even if the burden of proof had been shifted in her case, the prosecutor, I believe, called her an angry woman, said that she was not in fear for her life. She was angry. And again, I want to think about the racial gendered trope of the angry black woman. And indeed, that's what happened, is the jury didn't see her as somebody who was truly, legitimately fearful for her life, saw her as an angry person. So time and time again, I see this happening where in stay your ground states, there have been several cases in Kentucky since the book came out where women who are trying to protect themselves using lethal violence from their angry boyfriends, spouses, etc., the law comes down not on their side, it comes down on the side of the man.
Time for one more question.
Thank you so much for your work and all of you for your commentary. I wanted to ask, because this book deals so much with the question of sovereignty, and I am not a lawyer or I don't know about the law, so maybe this is also something that could be answered with cases that you may know about. I'm wondering how stand your ground has been applied in the cases of white Native violence and on Native territory, the use of firearms, how that would play into the narrative that you have presented us with of racialized and gendered violence and usage and claims on the Castle Doctrine.
Right. I thank you for asking that. I have to say, I don't know. I have been looking, actually, for cases where there are intrusions onto Native land by white people. And what I do have, though, is the long history of before the Stand Your Ground laws, when there was de facto a Castle Doctrine that never protected Native claims to their homes, to their land, to their sovereign space. So I don't know if there are cases that you all know of where in contemporary U.S. we see that play out, but I haven't yet. All I can say is it's part of a very long history of selective application of the Castle Doctrine.
Yeah, I don't know, Kieran. I haven't seen any, and I'll call Joe Singer after this is over and see what he says. But it's a great question. But I think you know what, if there are cases, what the likely trend would be.
I don't see any other hands. So at this point, I think we'll thank our panel and speakers. Thank you very much for joining us today.